Let's talk about BOD and eutrophication. I already talked to you in another screencast about eutrophication, but I just want to go ahead and tie these two so intimately linked together. I want to combine them. All right. So BOD is really what's known as biochemical oxygen demand, or sometimes we just call it biological oxygen demand. And basically what it means is this. If there is organic matter, food, in waterways, we're talking about starches, sugars, fats, proteins. So basically plant matter, feces, dead animals, all right, dead plants. Well, that is something that's going to get consumed by bacteria, aerobic bacteria. So these aerobic organisms then want to consume that food material, and that puts a demand on the oxygen in the water. So when there's a lot of food, organic matter, then there's going to be a lot of BOD. There's going to be a lot of oxygen demand because bacteria are going to want to eat that food. And as they do, they respire. And remember, populations of bacteria increase dramatically when there is availability of food. So what we find is the introduction of organic matter into an aquatic system tends to increase the BOD, and that causes a decrease in oxygen level, as we see in this graph here. So if I introduce organic matter, okay, feces, dead animals, sewage, grass clippings, what happens is this. The BOD is going to go up. And what that means is now there's a lot of food, there's a lot of organic matter there, bacteria are going to quickly multiply and start to consume it. And that puts BOD in there. That means there's demand for oxygen. So what happens? The dissolved oxygen in water plummets, all right? And it plummets low enough that it affects what species can exist in that aquatic environment, to the point that species like fish that have a fairly high metabolic rate, they can't live at those low oxygen levels. And sometimes we have these waterways where like suddenly all the fish die. So these fish kills are usually caused by an increase in BOD, which caused a decrease in DO. Now, when I say sources of BOD, really what I'm saying is sources of organic matter that lead to BOD, okay, that lead to the demand for oxygen. So the common ones are municipal sewage. So there's a sewer pipe or a sewage treatment plant, and something goes wrong, and they just have to dump sewage directly into a river or a lake, okay? Or you get animal waste from these large animal operations, so like where they're growing cows or pigs, and they basically take all the feces and they hold them in these ponds. It's really kind of gross. It's called lagoons. That's really gross, right? And these lagoons sometimes rupture, or there's a flooding event, and all these feces end up in the water. Well, guess what? Bacteria just love that, okay? BOD goes up, oxygen goes down. You can also get it from aquaculture operations, like where you're growing fish in order to, rather than fishing for them. Leaf litter, lawn clippings, people just dump yard waste in the river, or dead algae from a plankton bloom. So let's just talk about eutrophication again, because eutrophication causes a biologic oxygen demand. So here's what happens. Remember, in most aquatic environments, it is there's plenty of light and plenty of water for productivity. That's not a problem, right? But the problem is usually nutrients. So the thing that limits plant growth, in this case algal growth, is nitrogen and phosphorus. If those get introduced, usually through fertilizers, although it could be from other things, but usually from fertilizers, then what we find is the algae suddenly start to grow rapidly, because now they've got sunlight, they've got water, now they've got nutrients, they can start to grow cells, so we get these algae blooms. Well, these algae blooms get so thick that the turbidity is very high. Remember, turbidity is the ability, when turbidity is high, light doesn't penetrate well, right? So that the algae down at the lower levels, maybe a few centimeters below the surface, it's dark. They can't live there, so they die. And so this algae die and they settle to the bottom. Now there's BOD, because, so keep in mind, up here, photosynthesis, these algae are actually putting oxygen into the water through photosynthesis, right? However, when they die, what happens is bacteria eat them, and then there's BOD, right? Because those bacteria are going to start respiring, and they're going to, as they eat these dead algal cells, they're going to take up all the oxygen, and all of a sudden there's no oxygen left here. It becomes what we call hypoxic, or absent of oxygen. So here's an oxygen sagger, which I think is a really kind of cool thing. So these are for river systems where we have water that's moving, in this case from left to right. And what we find is this, okay, as the water is moving this way, at a certain point, there is a depositing of organic matter into the water. Let's say it's a ruptured sewer pipe. So suddenly there's a lot of organic matter in the river right here, the point of discharge. What that does is the BOD, the biologic oxygen demand, biochemical oxygen demand, is going to be very high at that point because suddenly there's all this food. So the bacteria are like, yes, and they begin to multiply. And as they do, they respire. So what happens is the oxygen starts to drop. But notice, since the river is flowing, the lowest oxygen level is not going to happen at the point of discharge because it's going to take the bacteria a while to start to grow and breathe. So as what happens is, as we move this way, the bacteria population is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and respiring more and more and more, and the oxygen is getting lower and lower and lower until we, at some point away from the discharge source, because remember the river is flowing, we reach this lowest point. And what's happened at that point here is that the bacteria have eaten so much of the material that their population begins to decline. Food is becoming scarce now. They've eaten most of it. So the BOD starts to drop off at that point because there's less bacteria demanding oxygen because they're not growing as fast. So what happens is the oxygen starts to come back up. Where is this extra oxygen coming from? It's mostly coming from mixing at the surface. So it's atmospheric oxygen that's mixing in with the water at the surface. It can also come from photosynthesis. But what happens is, as this water continues to move downstream, the amount of organic matter that was released gets further and further consumed until it's all but gone. And so there's very few bacteria left to eat it. It also gets diffused. And so the demand for oxygen gets very low, so the oxygen can come back up to a fairly normal place. So here's an example of one I think is just very graphic and easy to understand. So this shows our direction of flow. Again, it's from left to right. Here's our point of discharge. So look at this. Before the point of discharge, we have a clean zone with a very healthy population. We've got 8 ppm oxygen. We've got all these different fish species, high biodiversity. These are things that need fairly large amounts of oxygen to survive. It's what a healthy stream looks like in a normal ecosystem, okay, that we humans haven't been messing with. Now we dump all the sewage in there. Well, immediately the BOD goes way up, right? There's all of a sudden there's going to be a lot of demand for oxygen because the bacteria are going to start to multiply like crazy, but they're being swept downstream as they do. So as it gets swept downstream, they're eating that sewage, and so what's happening is the demand for oxygen is going down, but at the same time, the total amount of oxygen is going down until we get down to here at 2 ppm. Now in this first region, right after we dropped it, we're going basically between 8 and 2. We're on our way down, right? So what happens is fish can still live, but the fish that live there are ones that are adapted to unhealthy waterways. So we're typically talking things like carp, which we see in the Tanchan River, or gar, which are kind of like almost dinosaur-like fish that look like crocodiles. They're very cool looking, but they don't need a lot of oxygen. Eventually, it can be so bad that there's no fish left at all. There's just a few like worm-like things, tubifex worms or something like that, and bacteria, okay? But now, since most of the food has been consumed, the bacteria population starts to decline, and there's less of them respiring, so the oxygen can start to come back up. But still, there's still bacteria in the water. There just aren't as many anymore. But those that are there are still eating the organic matter, so the demand for oxygen keeps going down as food keeps getting consumed, and the population of bacteria keeps getting smaller, and eventually we get back up to that starting one. So we have this region again of healthy fish. So we find this healthy, and then we have trash fish, and a place in between where we might not get any fish at all if there's enough sewage that's released. And here's another graphic of it. I think it just sort of shows it also kind of pretty. Now, this doesn't just happen in rivers, okay? We can get what are called dead zones in the ocean, and these are a matter of pretty serious concern. So basically, this is just eutrophication in the ocean, but on a very large scale. So what happens is rivers tend to dump lots of agricultural waste products and municipal waste products like sewage into the ocean. And when they do, all these nutrients so as these nutrients flow off of the river into the ocean, the surface waters have algae blooms, and that the light gets blocked, and so the algae die, just like we were talking about before, and then the bacteria start to eat it. The only thing that's different between this and the other types of eutrophication events we're talking about is the scale. We're talking about rivers are dumping in vast amounts of this. This can cover thousands of square kilometers. These things are vast, and there's like no fish can live there. The oxygen demand is so great that basically there are no fish. So it's basically like we're here for thousands of square kilometers. Pretty creepy, right? Here's one. Okay, so the Mississippi River, which flows in here, actually flows in here, and the typical flow of the currents is this way. The nutrients that flow out of the Mississippi River into here, they're basically draining the entirety of the agricultural area of the Midwest of the United States. It's one of the world's most productive agricultural areas, and everyone's using fertilizer, and everyone's growing animals. So there's all these feces and all this fertilizer, and all it gets dumped into the ocean here. And so, surprise, surprise, we get this area here where there's very, very little oxygen, and that means there's very little fish. You can't fish there. There's nothing there. But now the difference is, unlike a lake where all the fish die, these fish swim out of the way. So we find is that these dead zones tend to lead to migrations of fish populations. Sometimes they lead to fish kills, but in the open ocean, usually the fish are able to avoid the areas. But you just end up these areas that just are no longer, they should be producing fish, and they're not. So they're mostly bad for fisheries. Hey, thanks for watching.